right. Take your Bibles and turn to the second chapter of the book of Haggai. Haggai. Yeah, I don't know. Whatever you want to say it. Haggai. 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 I don't know. You go Haggai. Haggai. And you know what? It's probably not even close. Probably like the H is pronounced like a Z and the G is pronounced like an S. No, I don't know. It's just foreign names. I'm probably butchering it. And his poor old Haggai's mum is like, that's not what I named him. It could be something completely, yeah. All right, Haggai chapter number 2. Man, I tell you what, 2 chapters, but there is a ton of stuff in Haggai, I've realized. And we're not going to be covering it all. Just covering it as a chapter tonight. Chapter number 2, verse number 1. Follow along as I read. In the 7th month, in the 21st day of the month. Anybody know what's going on then? It's a good guess, actually. Honestly, as the way of guesses go, that is you're in the ballpark. But you're about 3 months out. So 6 months out, maybe 3 months. It's actually the Feast of Tabernacles. So the Feast of Tabernacles is going on, which is a 7-week feast. You guys would have known this when you did your in-depth personal study through the book of Leviticus, as I'm sure you've all done. All right, yeah. So anyway, it's the Feast of Tabernacles taking place during this, which starts on the 15th day and goes for 7 days. And so this is on the 7th month in the 21st day of the month. Came the word of the Lord by the prophet Haggai, saying, speak now to Zerubbabel, the son of Shealtiel, governor of Judah, and to Joshua, the son of Josedek, the high priest, and to the residue of the people, saying, who is left among you that saw this house in her first glory? And how do you see it now? Is it not in your eyes in comparison of it as nothing? Yet now be strong, O Zerubbabel, saith the Lord, and be strong, O Joshua, son of Josedek, the high priest, and be strong, all ye people of the land, saith the Lord, and work. For I am with you, saith the Lord of hosts. According to the word that I covenanted with you when you came out of Egypt, so my spirit remaineth among you, fear ye not. For thus saith the Lord of hosts, yet once it is a little while, and I will shake the heavens and the earth and the sea and the dry land, and I will shake all nations, and the desire of all nations shall come, and I will fill this house with glory, saith the Lord of hosts. The silver is mine, and the gold is mine, saith the Lord of hosts. The glory of this latter house shall be greater than the glory of the former, saith the Lord of hosts. And in this place will I give peace, saith the Lord of hosts. In the 24th day of the 9th month, in the 2nd year of Darius, came the word of the Lord by Haggai the prophet, saying, we're on to the next bit, and I just read it like it was all one. Verse 10 begins a new section. In the 24th day of the 9th month, in the 2nd year of Darius, came the word of the Lord by Haggai the prophet, saying, thus saith the Lord of hosts, ask now the priests concerning the law, saying, if one bear holy flesh in the skirt of his garment, and with his skirt do touch bread or pottage or wine or oil or any meat, shall it be holy? And the priests answered and said, no. And then said Haggai, if one that is unclean by a dead body touch any of these, shall it be unclean? And the priests answered and said, it shall be unclean. Then answered Haggai and said, so is this people, and so is this nation before me, saith the Lord, and so is every work of their hands, that which they offer there is unclean. And now I pray you, consider from this day and upward, from before a stone was laid upon a stone in the temple of the Lord, since those days were, when one came to an heap and of 20 measures, but there was 10, when one came to the press vat for to draw out 50 vessels out of the press, there were but 20, I smote you with blasting and with mildew and with hail in all your labors of your hands. Yet ye turned not to me, saith the Lord. Consider now from this day and upward, from the 24th day of the 9th month, even from the day that the foundation of the Lord's temple was laid, consider it. Is the seed yet in the barn? Yea, as yet the vine and the fig tree and the pomegranate and the olive tree hath not brought forth. From this day will I bless you. And again, the word of the Lord came unto Haggai on the 24th day of the month, saying, Speak to Zerubbabel, governor of Judah, saying, I will shake the heavens and the earth. I will overthrow the throne of kingdoms, and I will destroy the strength of the kingdoms of the heathen, and I will overthrow the chariots and those that ride in them, and their horses, and their riders shall come down, every one by the sword of his brother. In that day, saith the Lord of hosts, will I take thee, O Zerubbabel, my servant, the son of Shealtiel, saith the Lord, and I will make thee as a signet, for I have chosen thee, saith the Lord of hosts. Thus ends the book of Haggai, chapter number 2. There's quite a bit in there, and even in a casual reading, you might be able to glean a little bit here. And we've got some notes here, and we'll try and get through as much as we can in the time that we have allotted. Feedback here out of chapter number 2. Who's got some deep, meaningful insights? Cornelius?
Verse 17 says, I spoke to you fasting and filled you with the tail and all the ladies with the hands with the so the heart
Yeah. Yeah. The good thing about these ones is that when they were rebuked or reproved by the prophet, they actually changed, which is Haggai probably was surprised because it probably wasn't really the normal way that they responded to prophets, but they responded to his preaching and they got right with God. That was 16 years in that where they were laboring for themselves, and they said, you've labored for 16 years in your own profit, and you've forgotten about the house of God, and you've forgotten about me, and how have you prospered in these last 16 years? And he said, you've labored much, you've done a lot, but not much results for it. He says, that's me, I'm blowing on it. You went to the press vat you put in 50, and you come out and there's 20. You put in 20, and you came out and there was 10. God was blowing on it and not making their work as prosperous. And he says, right, consider your hands. You got clean hands, or you defiled, you got sin in your life, is what he's saying. Yeah, for sure. Kohol.
These people for 16 years had been completely away from God, and they were just gone. They were just didn't even and they obviously had sin in their lives. Obviously, one way, not the way God, and they heard the word of God. Like they heard the prophet say, you're in sin. You need to actually repent. You need to get back to do what you were doing before. And when they did, as soon as they repented, as soon as they were dealt with the sin in their life and did what they needed to do and made their priorities right, God was back with them. Like he was just straight away, like I'm here, I'm with you. As soon as the person repents, it doesn't matter how far away they've been from God, it doesn't matter for how long, when they actually repent and they come forward and they say, I'm sorry, I'm going to do, and it's, they make things right in whatever way they need to do. God is with them like instantly.
Yeah.
And
Yeah. That verse from last week, I like, and I'm thinking about it throughout the week, is that the verse 13 of chapter 1, going backwards here before we go forwards, but that the Lord's messenger, Haggai, the Lord's messenger, in the Lord's message unto the people, and it's like God's message through God's messenger, and then verse 14, the Lord stirred up the spirit of Zerubbabel, the spirit of Joshua, and the spirit of the remnant of the people. Like the power of preaching to actually stir the hearts of people. That God's message through God's messenger stirred their hearts. And it does. That's my prayer. That's my prayer for family camp and Brother Farinella is may God's messenger bring God's message and stir the hearts. Yeah. 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 Yep. Yeah. And they were bringing their offerings during that whole 16 years. They were bringing their tithes and they were bringing their offerings and they were still doing those things, except God was blowing on it because their hands were not clean. Yeah. So, yeah, that's right on the money. Relevant then, relevant way back then, and still relevant today. Yep. Clean hands. Yeah, man, I've got wonderful notes in my Bible. Same thing. Like, and sometimes you go back reading, it's like, man, I forgot about that. Man, that's really good. How did I forget that really good thought that was put there? Yeah, yeah. I'm not 70 yet. You know? We're heading there though. Yes.
In that they're responsible, they and say what they did, and the rule for them is good, and they kind of serve, and it reaches people, and the rule is to serve as well. So he's actually carrying out what God wants him to do, and he's building the temple.
Yeah.
Read on about that royal, that longer, and the answers will have made and they should we also think as well, who are there whole great men or their shall he shall bring for hits on their own so it's like the power that and God is given to people that actually carry out work and what God is ordained to do. There's all because he actually got the heart of when which came on and said, what God said.
Yeah. Yep. Yep. Responded to the message of God. Yeah. Yeah. Lots of good stuff here, and honestly, there's more than we can deal with. Any last sort of thoughts here before I move on to what I got here? The verse that sort of stands out to me a little bit. Chapter number 2 and verse number 3 may seem you have to pair it up with Ezra. So verse 3 says, "Who is left among you that saw this house in her first glory, and how do you see it now? Is it not in your eyes in comparison of it as nothing?" Go back to Ezra, which is back in the historical section of the Old Testament, just before Job. Go back to Ezra, chapter number 3. They go back. There's a group of people before Ezra goes back to reestablish the temple and reestablish the city, and goes back to do that. But in Ezra chapter number 3, they didn't get very far in until 1 year or so, about 18 months in, and then political oppression came, political persecution and difficulties, and they had to leave off building. But they got to as far as the foundation. And in chapter number 3 and verse 10, it says, "And when the builders laid the foundation," Ezra 3, verse 10, "when the builders laid the foundation of the temple of the Lord, they set the priests in their apparel with the trumpets and the Levites, the sons of Asaph, with cymbals, to praise the Lord with the ordinance of David, king of Israel. And they sang together by course in praising and giving thanks unto the Lord, because he is good, for his mercy endureth forever toward Israel. And all the people shouted with a great shout." The laying of the foundation had been done with a great shout when they praised the Lord, because the foundation of the house of the Lord was laid. But many of the priests and Levites and chief of the fathers, who were ancient men that had seen the first house, when the foundation of this house was laid before their eyes, wept with a loud voice, and many shouted aloud for joy, so that the people could not discern the noise of the shout of joy, from the noise of weeping of the people, for the people shouted with a loud shout, and the noise was heard afar off. That's very significant. You think, man, this is a monumental occasion coming back from captivity, and yet there was a mixed response to actually what was taking place. There was the ancients, and then there was the young'uns. It doesn't say the young'uns, it does say ancients, and then there's those that laid the foundation. And there was great rejoicing. Man, there was rejoicing and wonderful at what is taking place. And then there was a section of weeping and sorrow at what's taking place. Now you get over to Haggai chapter number 2, and you read this, and it says, verse number 3, "Who is left among you that saw this house in her first glory?" So they're rebuilding the temple, right? The temple, they were in captivity for 70 years. The temple was destroyed 12 years into that captivity. So that is 58 years. And then there was 16 years to this point that Haggai is preaching, where they started to rebuild after the captivity, and then they had left off. So 58 plus 16 is... It's a Wednesday night. It's like, hey, just got up early. Yeah, we were up early. I was up at 6 this morning, or before 6. 74. So 74. So there are those that are quite likely, if they were in their 80s, to 90s, right? They were 10 to 15 years of age, maybe, when Solomon's temple was destroyed, and then they were taken into captivity. And so they, in their lifetime, saw the temple before Nebuchadnezzar destroyed it. And what was that temple like? Well, it was the pride of Jerusalem. It's what they loved. I mean, if someone came and visited, we're trying to go, Rhiannon and I are going through, like, what are we going to do when the Farinellas are here? And you know what we have on the list? Kings Park, we have a river cruise, and we have... Cavish and Wildlife Park to see some native animals, and we've got Fremantle. We're going to show them around our town. Well, guess what they do? If someone comes in from out of town into Jerusalem, guess what was number 1 on the list? You've got to see the temple. Man, this is unreal. This is amazing. It's overlaid with gold. I mean, the artwork, it was built in the zenith of our nation. Solomon was the wealthiest man alive, and this is what he's left to us. This is amazing. This is Solomon's temple, and it's been passed down, the history, the heritage. I mean, it was wonderful. In fact, that's what actually got Nebuchadnezzar's attention, wasn't it? Hezekiah said, come check out the temple. Come look at the wealth, the gold, the riches, the overlay of it. This is amazing. And it actually what brought their attention and came back and razed the whole place and stole everything. And so they remember it. There were some in those days that said, we remember what it was like. And here is this foundation. And Zechariah says this. Because Zechariah, we're about to come to, is a contemporary with Haggai. And so he says this, "For who hath despised the day of small things? For they shall rejoice and shall see the plummet in the hand of Zerubbabel with those 7. They are the eyes of the Lord which run to and fro throughout the whole earth. Who has despised the day of small things?" There is one commentator, a few commentators make mention that it might very well be relaying to the laying of the foundation. That the actual footprint, because it was scaled. It had to be, if you go back to the tabernacle, it was X amount long and then twice as long as it was wide, right? So it's scaled. So it's very much likely that Solomon's was scaled up, and then this one is scaled back down because of, well, constraints, not as many people, not as much money in the bank, like a whole heap of things why this one is smaller. And just the foundation of it, just the footprint alone, this younger generation is like, this is amazing. We are entering in and rebuilding what our fathers were engaged in. And then the ones that saw Solomon's temple before it was destroyed are weeping, going, oh, this is just not like it was. I remember the days. I remember the glory days. And he asks this, verse 3, who is left among you that saw this house in her first glory? It's like asking the ancients. Guess what we have in our church? We have ancients. And we could rightly ask this question. Maybe more on a Sunday morning when there's more of a larger group. But we could ask this question. Who is left among you that saw this house in her first glory? And there'd be hands that go up. Yeah, I've been here for, if Rochelle was here, she'd say, I've been here for however long she's been here, 100 years, 57 years. I said, Rochelle, that's not true. I said, you started coming here that many years ago. You haven't been here for that long because you haven't been here for the last 2. That's not how math works. But you can ask those questions. And if we had those people come up and you say, okay, I remember it, and then be a group that says, I don't remember it. And you might say that, who is left among you that saw this house in her first glory? And how do you see it now? I mean, I asked the question, but I know the answer. You know why I know the answer? Because I've heard it a lot. And you know how the ancients see it today? Different. 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 And it's for a myriad of reasons, different. Who is left among you that saw this house in her first glory? And how do you see it now? We'd call up those people. How do you see it now? I think that's probably the best answer to describe to everything. Different. It's different now. It is different. In fact, he goes on to say this. Is it not in your eyes in comparison of it as nothing? It's just, I remember when there was we were 80 people on a Sunday morning regular. I remember this and I remember that. But it's easy in every generation to go, I remember the glory days. And if you pulled up the ancients, they'd almost weep. And they literally were weeping. Oh, this is just not like I remember it. And yet the younger generation is like, woo! We're serving God. This is fantastic. We're excited to be here. And they're rejoicing. And the others are like, no, this is just, I tell you, if I could just take you in a time machine. I'd take you back and I'd show you what it really could have looked like. And what do you think that does to morale? Honestly, what do you think it does to morale? It doesn't help morale when the old people are weeping and the younger ones are rejoicing. And so he comes along and he says to Zerubbabel, who's there in the midst of this, and he says to Zerubbabel, yet now be strong. Be strong, Zerubbabel. And saith the Lord, and be strong, O Joshua of Jehozadak. You know what I like about Zerubbabel, what it says here? It says this in verse 2. Speak now to Zerubbabel, the son of Shealtiel. It means he is now like a generation later, and Shealtiel was there in the glory days, and he was taken into captivity. You can read about that in 2 Chronicles. And now his son is taking over. And you know who Joshua? Joshua is now a generation, and his father knew the days before as well. And you have the children of those who knew the glory days, quote unquote, and they're there. And you know what? Haggai comes to the children, to the sons of, and he says, be strong. Be strong, yet now be strong and work. And be strong, all you people of the land, saith the Lord, and work. Why? Because exactly what Cole says. I am with you. But it's not like the glory days, quote unquote. Well, God is saying, well, who deems what is the glory days? No, who deems what is the glory days? Because he's saying, I am with you. I am the Lord of hosts. Go work in your generation and in your time. Because guess what? If you rewound to the 80s, we'd go, oh, the 80s, man, people were getting saved and we'd have invitations, people were coming forward and they were getting baptized. And you know what? There would have been the ancients in the 80s and they were from the 50s. And you know what they'd be saying? Oh, yeah, not like my day, though. In my day in the 50s, and this is true, in the 50s, man, they were graduating Bible college in America. True, you ask Brother Smith this. in the 50s and the 60s. They were graduating Bible college out of Baptist Bible College, and they would graduate on the Friday night or the Thursday night, and they would have a U-Haul trailer that they had rented with all their life belongings, and they were saying, we're going to this town to start a church, and they would go off to whatever town they were, up to young 20-year-old, 22 and 23-year-olds, going to some little podunk town in the middle of nowhere, and because God had called them there, and and that Sunday they'd start a church, and they'd build a church there. Well, that hasn't happened for a very long time, and it wasn't even happening in the 80s. And they would say, probably the ancients in the 1980s would say, oh, well, yes, but it's not like my day. And guess what would have been happening in the 1950s? The ancients in the 1950s that were from the 1920s were going, yeah, that's okay, and I'm glad you're starting churches there in the country, but let me tell you about my day. Man, D.L. Moody and Billy Sunday, and man, Billy Sunday was preaching, and he'd come into our towns, and he'd build up these massive, tents, and he would put down the sawdust trail, and thousands of people would come out and listen to him preach, and he'd preach against the liquor and the alcohol, and he'd be against all of that, and man, thousands of people. And then the ancients of their day were saying, well, let me tell you about my day. Let me tell you about when I traveled to England and saw Spurgeon preach. That man had London on a string. And then someone is saying, and you could come up with whatever it is. You know, the most I can remember being baptized at one time in my living memory at this church was 6. In one time. Man, that was big for us. 6 people on one session in one Wednesday, Sunday night after the youth camp at Calbarry. 6 people. 5 teenagers and 1 adult. All got baptized. Man, what a hallelujah time that was. And someone in that day could have been like, that's the glory days when 6 people were getting baptized at one time. And you know what? Someone could have said this. Yeah, but it's not like it was back in the book of Acts. They had 5,000 getting baptized on one day. Right, if you start comparing, this is my point. If you start comparing to every other generation, guess what? It's different. Every single time it's different. But guess what's not different? The Spirit of God. And God is still at work. And His people are still at work. And things are still at work. And we might say, okay, it's different. Right. But rejoice that God is still at work and there's a generation that still cares to serve Him. And still cares to send people out. And it's different. And guess what? Things are different. The preaching is different. And the way the church operates is different. We're not as in, people aren't as live in Mount Helena and live in the close proximity. We're sort of spread out a little bit more and it hinders how we operate. But we have people sort of scattered further around. We have things going on in Collie, and we have sent a man out to Collie. We're involved in that. We've got the city, and people are coming to the city, and it's different. It is different. It's spread thinly, a bit wider. It's different. But He says this, but just know this, that I am with you, God says. And as much as you might say, it's different. Well, don't wreck the morale of the youngs, because the young don't know that it's different. The young just know, hey, we're serving God, and I'm excited to come and sing praises to Him, and I'm excited to hear the preaching. Oh, yeah, but that preacher's not like the preacher I grew up under. Okay, it's true, but guess what? They're both preaching about the same God. They're both preaching about the same Jesus who raised from the dead. It's different, yeah, it is. But man, we get to serve God. And I know this, and I've said this to preachers in America. How's things? And I genuinely have said this in private, and this verse makes me say it in public. And I'd say our church is sort of, if I could divide it down the middle and put people halfway between 90 and divide at 45, I said there's a 45 attitude, there's a after 45 attitude, and there's an under 45 attitude. And most of the issues, not that they're issues, but most of the grumbling comes from post 45. I don't think I've really had much issues at all with anyone from under 45. And it's not, I'm not being negative or like, I'm merely stating as I read this verse, you know what? It was like that in Haggai's day because it was different. And it's difficult at times to get your head around different. Because, man, I'm telling you, Solomon's temple in the sense of was a grand and glorious thing. And what Zerubbabel was building isn't really as grand. But you know what God says? He says, look, verse 6, thus saith the Lord of hosts, yet once it is a little while, and I will shake the heavens and the earth and the sea and the dry land, and I will shake all nations, and the desire of all nations shall come. Well, what is the desire of all nations? Well, in Christmas time we say it's Jesus. That's not the desire of all nations. You know what the desire of all nations is? Money. Oh, if you're wealthy, because guess what the temple was like that Solomon built? It was wealthy. It was overlaid with gold and silver. That's the desire of all nations. But look what he says here in verse number 8. The silver is mine and the gold is mine, saith the Lord of hosts. What you think was glorious, he says, that belongs to me. I own all of that. And then he says in verse number 9, the glory of this latter house shall be greater than of the former, saith the Lord of hosts. Well, the glory of the former house was way better. Well, God is saying, well, actually, the glory days are yet ahead. And it's not to be just quaint in our sayings and just to throw out some cliche, but if you're a Christian, your best days are yet ahead. It's when Jesus comes and he says he's going to fill, and his glory is going to fill this place. And then when Jesus is ruling and reigning, guess what all the nations do? They come to Jerusalem to worship. And guess what they did in Jerusalem in Solomon's day when all the nations came? Guess what they brought? Silver and gold and wealth. And guess what's going to happen when Jesus rules and reigns and the nations come to worship him in Jerusalem? Guess what they're going to bring? Silver and gold. And the desire of nations are going to flow back into this place, he says. And it's going to be glorious, even more glorious at the end than it ever was a generation ago or 2 generations ago or whatever, because the true glory days are yet ahead. And how God works in an individual generation, it might be different, and there might be different results, and there might be different things, but God is still at work. He is still at work in this generation like he was at work in the other generation. And he was like in the generation before and the generation before and on and on. And so we can look at this and be encouraged and say, you know what? It might be different, but God puts his arm around Zerubbabel and he says, just go to work. I am with you, and keep building. And if we get to Zechariah's day and we read the prophecies there, we find out God blesses Zerubbabel. Is it different? Does Zerubbabel's temple ever get to what Solomon's temple was? No. But God greatly blessed Zerubbabel, and his name was greatly magnified. And that's really what the goal is to bring glory to God and to give honor in him, and not compare necessarily to what it was like and what it could be like or what it should be like. Let's just serve God. And let's come and just enjoy the house of God. And let's work to reach souls and work to expand the kingdom of God through local churches in Collie and in the city and wherever else, and through this own place as well. And there's people coming to church and visitors coming back. They've said they're coming back this Sunday. Well, let's work to be a blessing to them, be an encouragement to them, and be friendly to them. And let's see new people fill up this house and make this house glorious in its own generation, in its own way. Let's just serve God. Let's serve God. All right, find a prayer partner or two tonight. Find a prayer partner or two tonight, and we will bring the